So I came up with this talk about 6 months ago, and Catriona said, "Oh, do you want to come and talk?" And I went, "Yes." And she said, "Could I have a title?" And I went, "Yes." And then without thinking, I went, "Ooh." I thought that sounded quite clever. I kind of regret it now, but having spent a bit of time trying to put this together, the alternative title for this talk would be Scotland Dare to be Average. And hopefully I'll explain why. Anyway, so coming up with something, talking about moderation is really difficult intrinsically because there's something just a bit boring about moderation. And I'm going to go through some of the questions I was thinking about when I tried to put this talk together. So what counts as moderate use of different drugs? Are better quality drugs better for your health? Are moderate quality drugs preferable when you're trying to self-regulate use? Would a regulated market easier to help? Would it help people moderate their use? Kind of maybe, for example, through taxation. Do we need to have periods of excess in order to learn the wonders of moderation? How do you get people to nudge towards moderation? And how do you market it? Because as I said, there's something intrinsically dull about moderation. And Oscar Wilde would seem to agree, moderation is a fatal thing. Nothing succeeds like excess. Fortunately, he was a complex man. As he got older, he came up with another saying, which is everything in moderation, including moderation, and I would say probably including excess. Because I think most guidelines talk around moderating use as if you have to moderate your life at all times. And clearly, that's not really doable or enjoyable for many people. But when you think about the way drugs affect us, the truth is that drug-related pleasure tends to increase with the dose up until a certain point, at which point actually things start to diminish. It's an inverted U-curve. And I think when we think about moderation or self-regulation, the way we might want to market this to people is around the idea of experience optimization. How are you going to get the most pleasure from this experience or activity? Clearly, moderation is a challenge. It's probably not something that is an option for people who are dependent upon a drug. I think for many people who are dependent, the idea of returning to self-regulation is almost impossible. There's something around the human condition that when you're stressed, our physiological response makes it difficult to make decisions, to plan ahead, to moderate our use. We live in a culture that celebrates excess. You know, we've almost got an inbuilt algorithm that says more is better. A lot of us kind of maybe come from cultures where there are chaotic or excessive norms. And a lot of us tend to dismiss short-term consequences because they're fun. We discount kind of long-term negative harms. And then, of course, when it comes to drugs, the whole issue is complicated because drugs disinhibit your decision-making. So it's really difficult. The other thing, of course, that makes moderation really difficult for people to engage with and market is the war on drugs. So the issue for me is rather complex, and as always, the truth is going to lie somewhere in the murky middle. And I think one of the ways that we start challenging that complexity is by having some honest conversations about why people use drugs and that you can use drugs without necessarily ruining your life. And that's about changing the conversation, which is what Global Drug Survey tries to do. It's also about thinking the spectrum of people who use drugs in society. It's a very small minority, maybe 5 or 10% of people who end up in treatment who have got problems. For the rest of the other kind of people who use drugs, I think self-regulation really is something that we could market and sell as a way of helping people reduce their risk. But I also think that it's not for everyone. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about is an ideal world where we can have honest conversations with the hidden masses. I think it's also true to say that self-regulation and moderation is not going to be appropriate for every drug. I think the synthetic cannabinoid drugs are very difficult to moderate. They're very difficult to use safely. And I think probably within Scotland, drugs like Itislam may also fall into that category. So I'm going to talk about some data from the Global Drug Survey. So it's a non-probability sample. This is not a sample that you come to tell you what the prevalence of drug use is within the country. But our 8th survey is currently underway. I think we're just shy of 60,000 people at the moment, and our survey, I think, is translated into 20 languages this year. It's one of a number of data sources. It's a complementary data source to household surveys, stuff done by the UNODCP and EMCDA, and it just adds some granularity and depth to some of the things that we're interested in. And I think one of the things that we've learned is the most credible source of information for people who use drugs are other people who use drugs. So a lot of what we try and do is repackage peer expertise and experience into both research papers, but also to a range of free apps that help people think about their use. But before I think about how we help people moderate their drug use, I think there's a couple of other things we need to moderate first of all. So the first I've already touched on is drug policy. Instead of aspiring to zero use, we should be trying to aspire to zero drug-related harm. I think there's virtually nothing that we should have zero tolerance for. There's a couple of exceptions, and my own personal exceptions would be pineapple on pizza, people who wear socks with flip-flops, and yeah, that man. Drug regulation is clearly a really good thing, but I've spent a bit of time recently in the States, and I don't want you to think that drug regulation and legalized markets is the way of promoting moderation, because if you've got businesses involved, then they are interested in selling as much product as possible. And the marketing of cannabis in the US is extreme. So this is from Seattle and Denver. You know, really high-end, sophisticated marketing with a range of products that honestly is just mind-blowing. These companies will not be interested in selling cannabis to promote public health. These companies will be interested in selling cannabis to maximize profit. There are other options. You can have public monopolies, for example. Anyway, the other thing I think we need to talk about is moderating our language. And that's really important if you actually want to change the conversation. Language that we see in the press dehumanizes people. It stigmatizes people. It places distance between us and them. It allows us to ignore 3,000 drug-related deaths. It allows us to cut funding without feeling concerned or troubled. And I think we all need to change our language. Little things matter. I still sometimes talk about drugs and alcohol. No, alcohol's a drug. It's alcohol and other drugs. I catch myself saying, oh, that person's a heroin user. No, that is a person who uses heroin. We've got to stop defining people by the drugs that they use. And interestingly, the UNODCP has come up with a guide about better language. And we should do that because that will help us move away from a very ideologically driven dislike of people who use drugs. Now, we all probably have our own internal moral compass when it comes to drugs, but I think we also recognize that whether or not you end up with a problem in drugs is around the roots and social matrix that you've grown up within. You want to reduce the drug problem in society, you start reducing social inequality, poverty, deprivation. They are the really hard things. You know, using drugs when you're an adolescent doesn't mean that you're going to grow up and not unfortunately be Prime Minister of this country. One of the things that I think is going to help us shift that language is that there's something weird going on. We've got a bunch of things that were drugs of abuse a few years ago, but now they're medicines. MDMA, LSD, psilocybin, ketamine. These are not drugs of abuse. These are new medicines that if you get them prescribed by a doctor, can help you with your depression or your PTSD or your chronic pain. I think all of those things are quite useful. Anyway, I'm going to go through alcohol, coke, and MDMA, and I'm going to try and put Scotland on the map. And it's not necessarily that good, guys. So, last year, one of the headlines the Global Drug Survey got was basically British people got drunk more than anyone else in the world. It was the least interesting and least scientifically robust finding. And I did 26 interviews, basically saying, why did the British get pissed so much? And it was just like, because of Brexit. It's like, it's not interesting. But anyway, on average, people are getting drunk about once a week. So, Anglo cultures generally don't do moderation very well. You know very well the negative impacts of alcohol use on society and on culture and on individuals. So I'll just tell you a little bit about what we've learned from Scotland and alcohol. So this is data from a couple of years ago. This is 1,000 drinkers from Scotland. And if we just look at their audit scores, you've got about 15% of this population being possibly dependent, which is a bit high. How does that rank when we look at their audit scores for 27 other countries? Well, if you look at scores above 16, Scotland is top. And if you look at scores above 20, Scotland is top. Then if we ask people every year, have you ended up in the emergency department in the last year as a result of drinking? And Scotland is top. 4.2% of those 1,000 people who responded to GDS said they'd sought emergency medical treatment. Quite a lot of Scottish people would like to drink less. About 41% said they'd like to drink less, and some of them would like to drink less. But in order for people to think about cutting down on what they're using, they have to have some insight into the nature of their problem. I love this picture. So one of the things that we've become quite interested in is this whole idea of normative misperception, which is the whole idea of underestimating your own alcohol consumption to kind of make you feel better. And this was some work done by some colleagues at UCL using GDS data. But basically, a quarter of people who are alcohol dependent and a third of those people who are drinking at high risk levels thought their drinking was average or less than average. And you were more likely to underestimate that risk if you were British, white, young, male, and unemployed. So the highest risk drinkers had the greatest level of delusion. And in fact, the UK full stop were the most deluded country. How much do people in the UK need to drink to be as happily drunk as they want to be? So in Ireland, I'll tell you, it was about 9 pints of Guinness for men and 1 3/4 bottles of wine for women. In the UK, it worked out to be about 140 grams of alcohol. This is to be as happily drunk as you want to be, which basically is equal to about 7 pints of strong lager, which is well above the 14 units that we're all told we can't drink in the whole week. So we drink too much and we don't seem to care too much about guidelines. What do we care about? Well, one of the things that lots of organisms are programmed to pay attention to is ranking. So from monkeys to crayfish, we're really interested in our social rank. And apparently crayfish get drunk faster when they've been hanging out with friends. But the reason I show this is there was a lovely study done by people in Cardiff. And basically what they did is they followed a bunch of people on a night out and they breathalyzed them, got them to tell them how much they'd been drinking, but also they looked at the drinking of their friends that evening. And most people said they were moderately drunk on a night out. But what was really interesting is when the researchers asked people how drunk did they feel, the most important thing was not actually how much they had drunk, it was how much did they think they had drunk in comparison to their peers. The more sober people they were with, the more drunk they feel. So it's about ranking. You could get everyone to go out and have just as good a night out if everyone just agreed to drink 2 pints each. It was about your ranking that determined how drunk you felt, not your absolute amount. And if you increase the number of sober people, that actually probably encourages people to drink less. And if you want to know what a drunk crayfish looks like, it's that. So does normative misperception apply to other drugs? And can you use normative misperception to nudge people's behavior? So we looked at data from Global Drug Survey with Mike Shiner, who's a sociologist at LSE, and exactly the same thing was seen. For ecstasy and cocaine, more than half of even the heaviest users, so these were people using more than 2 grams a week of coke or more than 1 gram a week of MDMA, thought they were no more than above average, no more than average users. Completely delusional. But what was really interesting in is that people's desire to cut down wasn't just them recognizing that they were themselves heavy consumers, it was them recognizing they were heavier consumers than everyone else. So we can harness people's rank and their perception of their use to encourage people to drink less or use less drugs. And apps have done this, so we've got a drinks meter app which provides you with feedback on calories and units and various other things, but it provides you with some normative feedback. It'll tell you how your drinking compares to other people. And in fact, what we also do is then adjust your drinking based on your own personal risk factors. People don't like this. People don't like having their fairy tale smashed because it gets them to think about what they're doing and hopefully encourages them to drink less. And we've got these apps for various other drugs. But it's just as an example of saying how you can use rank possibly to shift behavior. But there's other things that get people to think about using less and to moderate their use. So a few years ago, we looked at motivations to drink less. Now, top of the list were things like serious sexual assault, physical health harms. But in some countries, physical health was really important. A lot of people were quite worried about physical health harms. And this is just my plea to the Scottish government to put mandatory alcohol health warning labels on all their drinks. You've got minimum pricing. Mandatory health warning labels would be really a good thing to do. In some countries, though, and particularly for younger people, motivations to drink less can't be based on things like health. because when you're 18, you're going to live forever. When you're 18, the most important thing is what your peers think of you. Basically, does alcohol lead to social humiliation? So we came up with this 3-minute online tool called One Too Many. Basically takes 3 minutes. It basically says, asks you nothing about how much you've drunk. It just says, have you got so drunk that people have taken embarrassing photographs? Have you got so drunk you can't remember what you'd done the night before? Have you ended up in bed with the wrong person? And you get a score, and that score is the alcohol-related social embarrassment score, or the arse score. And the top score is culus ingentissimus, which is Latin for big arsehole, which unfortunately is going to be the only bloody thing that you lot remember today. But anyway, so it's just thinking about different ways of nudging people and encouraging moderation. And actually this year we're going to ask people, how many times a year do you think the government should say that you can get drunk? Which is going to be fascinating to see what number Scotland comes up with. And there's a couple of other trends. I want to quickly think about Coke and MGMA in 5 minutes, is that right? Shit, okay. Right, so you like your Coke a few years ago. Apparently Scotland was fake cocaine capital of the world. But now you've got really good quality Coke, and that's led to an increase in drug-related deaths. Does our data support this? Yeah, about 1% we're using, 20% we're using 1 gram a day, 20% we're using 2 grams a day or more in Scotland, which compared not very favourably with every other country. I don't know whether this is because the purity of Coke in Scotland was much worse than the rest of the world, but it's fairly striking that the amount people reporting using was really much greater. Interestingly, value for money in Scotland was pretty much the same as the rest of the world, and the value for money for cocaine has doubled in the last 5 years for Scotland. We also find that Scotland can get cocaine delivered quicker than anyone else. And of course, you can end up getting overweight and using Coke in middle age. Unfortunately, it hasn't ruined his career sufficiently yet. I want to think about cannabis use. We need to think about moderating tobacco in cannabis use. We also need to think about moderating people's use to help them quit. We can use cannabis health labels perhaps to get people to think about using less. I think if we're going to moderate people's use, we need to start thinking about having guidelines so people know how much Coke is too much Coke, how much cannabis is too much cannabis. And so we've taken data from 40,000 people and produced cannabis guidelines so people can identify what level of risk they're at. For MDMA, the issues, of course, are higher potency pills and higher purity powders. How does Scotland fit in? Well, you've got the overwhelming majority of people using less than 10 times a year, like the rest of the world. But in terms of the amount used on a day, Scotland's up there with 1.8 pills on a day. In terms of grams of powder, Scotland's up there with 0.6 of a gram of MDMA powder. There's a fairly consistent story here. Highest rates of seeking emergency medical treatment as well. So again, this is around encouraging people to use less, but marketing it as perhaps having more fun as well. Most of the people who end up in the emergency department from taking MDMA, I think a lot of those problems could have been avoided by changing people's behaviour, and part of that could be changed by having better information about the drugs they're using. But we need to do something because we're having escalating deaths related to MDMA in the UK, and about 20% of those deaths are in people aged under the age of 20. There is something about people's very first time when they use drugs, when they are the most vulnerable. We've estimated that your risk of turning up in the emergency department is at least 3 times greater that very first time when you use drugs. So we need to have checklists for people for the first time they're going to use drugs, not as a way of saying drug use is safe, but as a way of getting them to think about safer ways of using. I think we need moderate safer use guidelines for virtually everything, even drugs that we think are really risky. Drugs like GHB, where we know there's a tiny difference between a dose that gets you happy and horny and a dose that gets you to pass out. And if you want to communicate with gay men who use GHB, you need to accept that GHB is a drug that apparently is great to have sex on and is fun. You can't tell people don't do G if they enjoy it. So we collaborated with the Gay Men's Health Collective, who made a video for us called There's More to G Than Cock, which has a lot of penis all over it. And, but, we have accepted that, This is something that people want to engage with, and we just created a little video that's on YouTube around various risks. Using humour to engage people can be quite a helpful thing if you're talking about things that are really difficult. I also think we also need to think about moderation for drugs that we think actually might be super safe. So a drug like laughing gas, nitrous oxide, is a remarkably safe drug for the majority of people. But for about 3 or 4% of people who use nitrous oxide, because of inactivation of vitamin B12, there is a risk of peripheral nerve damage. And so we need to advise people. You don't want to do more than 4 or 5 balloons 3 or 4 times a year. So it doesn't matter what the drug, it's about having the right communication to people that lets them understand that how they choose to use their drugs and the choices that they make can make a significant difference to the risks they're exposed to. I think for most people, all you have to do is just let people grow up a bit. You know, adolescence is a time of excess because excess can be amazing fun. We just want to get people through those incredibly risky times. So hopefully by the time they get a bit older, they understand that moderation in most things, including excess, is the path to your happiest life. This is a video, but apparently we haven't got video. It's just a plug for the Global Drug Survey. So there we are. There's the plug for the Global Drug Survey. Send it out on your social networks. Tell people to share some time and help us make drug use safer. And I'll end it there. Thank you.
I think we've got time for 1, maybe 2 quick questions. Anyone would like to raise a hand?
I just love it. It was all so crystal clear.
Question there.
Hello, hi, thanks very much. I was just wondering, so you mentioned about the kind of idea about first-time drug use being associated with kind of higher risks. I was just wondering how you kind of communicate that in an educational context, given that that might kind of increase kind of anxieties as well.
Well, in a way, I do kind of want to increase anxieties. Like that checklist is there, so the first time you're going to think about taking a drug, you're going to go, do I know where I'm going to be that night? Do I know who I'm going to be with? Do I know how I'm going to get home? Have I checked this drug? If that makes people slightly anxious, I think that's quite a good thing, because it's about do your homework. And the other thing we say is drugs don't go off. Like if you decide today that you're not really feeling terribly robust or happy, you don't have to do drugs today. Like drugs don't go off like milk in the fridge. So the whole point of those checklists is actually to raise a little bit of anxiety so people take it seriously. And people who take psychedelics are generally incredibly sensible and respectful of their drug experience. And if we could get most people who use most drugs to be as respectful of their experience as psychedelic users were, actually drug use would probably be far safer. A little anxiety ain't a bad thing.